So good evening, and thank you all for coming. Quite a hospitality. What I'll try to do today a little bit is to talk about what Israeli militarism looks like, and then also a little bit about what kind of some of the resistance to it looks like, and how, hopefully, maybe how you can also get involved in that. We will have time for questions later, but if you have any clarifying questions or anything of the sort while I'm speaking, please feel free to just say so. So I'll start by saying that for me, when we talk about Israeli society and we talk about militarism, obviously one of the first things that everybody thinks about is conscription, right? Israel has mandatory military service for both men and women at the age of 18. It's 2 years for women and 3 years for men. But I think that that's only really the kind of tip of the iceberg, because when you really think about militarism, what creates soldiers is much more than just a law, much more than just conscription itself. And at least part of what I'll be trying to talk about is kind of that. What are those systems? The other thing that we often don't see as much around militarism is the transparent parts of it. How does it affect Israeli civil society after conscription, regardless of conscription? What are kind of the biggest systems around that? So I'll try to touch a little bit on some of those things. I obviously won't get to it all, but hopefully we'll be able to continue that conversation later as well. So I think that one of the first things that you have to notice, have any of you been in Israel, in Israeli cities at all? Some of you have been. Probably one of the things that you notice, especially coming from the UK, is the amount of guns on the streets, right? Because here you don't really see them anywhere. But in Israel, there's weapons everywhere. It's weapons on soldiers, either on duty or off duty. So combat soldiers take their assault rifles home when they go home for a weekend, which means you go out to a pub on a Friday night and you'll be sitting next to an M16 assault rifle. And that's something that we're very much used to seeing. It's like the environment itself is militarized, is normalizing weapons. You can see behind me a roundabout from a city called Beersheba in the south. On the roundabout, the mayor decided that the way to decorate it is a decommissioned fighter jet. That mayor happens to be the ex-commander of the Air Force, which is why he thought that was a good idea. But the idea is that you see weapons everywhere. And when you see something everywhere, it becomes normalized. It becomes unthreatening. Israelis don't really see weapons as something that's threatening or dangerous anymore. I was living in this city up north near the border with Lebanon, and the entrance to the city has 3 tanks, and they're like pink, green, and yellow. And, kids climb on them and play on them, and it's all fun and games. But that's exactly the kind of message that passes. Weapons are not something you need to be afraid of. There's something that's just part of your daily reality. And if we go on to what that looks like more in education, this is probably, it's a really good example, but it's also a terrible piece of paper. It was given to kids to teach them how to count. And we're talking about, 3-4-year-olds more or less, right, that are learning how to count. And so you can see the numbers from 1 to 10, and then also the symbols that relate to them. And they include tanks and airplanes. You probably can't recognize the symbol at the bottom line. That's the symbol of the Israeli Defense Force, of the Israeli military. Interestingly enough, there's some other things on that probably pop out. Anyone? What do you see there? Right, the doves, the olive branches, what are they doing there? There's some other symbols there. The flag of Israel is the first one. You have the symbol of the state, the Star of David, Knesset, our parliament. If you had to kind of think, what was the person putting that all together? What were they thinking? What do these have in common? So this whole, that's what the state is. And I really think that many times the people putting these things together, they're not thinking, I'm going to brainwash kids, right? That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, well, I need to put together a piece of paper around Israel. What is Israel? What symbolizes Israel for me? Right? And it's the institutions, it's the symbols, peace, obviously, who doesn't want peace, and the military. The military is part of the identity of the state. If I were to ask you, and I'm going to ask for slogan, stereotypical answers here, not what you actually think. But if I were to ask, the common answer to why does the state of Israel exist, why should it exist, what would usually be the answer? Because of the Holocaust. What about the Holocaust means that the state of Israel needs to exist? This whole idea of there was historical persecution of Jews, obviously the Holocaust being the worst example of that, and saying what we need in order to prevent that is a state, right? But what are we actually saying when we are saying we need a state? Why is a state helpful to stop persecution? What we actually mean is this idea that the Jews need a military to protect themselves. And in that sense, when you think about militarism in Israeli society, it's really key to the identity of what the state is. And this is just one manifestation of it, how much it's an integral part of the identity of the state itself. If we go on kind of in the education system, then really, as I said before, it's a lot about normalizing militaristic ideas. So just as an example here, this was taken from a book of the Ministry of Education teaching math to second graders. I'm not sure everyone can read the questions. I will say that the questions in Hebrew also include questions about packets of chocolate, but I didn't translate those for you. The ones I did say, in a unit there are 27 soldiers, they need to stand in 3 equal lines. How many soldiers will there be in each line? And then you reverse the question to make it easier. In a unit there are 27 soldiers, they need to stand in threes. How many lines of 3 will there be? The idea here is obviously not, I mean, again, the person putting this together wasn't thinking, I'm going to militarize these kids. It's just that the automatic examples for people, together with packs of chocolate, are going to be soldiers, because it's just such a big part of our identity. But it also means that for kids, they understand these messages, right? They're used to seeing that in their textbook, that they understand that that's what's going to happen. I remember myself in elementary school, we had a plaque in the entrance to the school with the names of all the kids from our school that died in the military. And that's the first thing you'd see every morning when you'd come into school. So this idea of military service, and possibly even dying as part of military service, is something that's really internalized from a very, very young age. If we kind of do go on to high school, then the military there really is everywhere. One of the examples here that you can see on the right is from a 10th grade in Israel. They're having a lecture about leadership and Zionism. And so the decision of the school was to bring soldiers to speak about that, because who better to speak about leadership than soldiers, as if that's the only context in which you can find it. But you can see a soldier sitting with his assault rifle in a class, talking to them. And that's something that's, for us, very normal. Nobody would question this. Nobody thinks that is a strange picture. The picture on the left, on the other hand, is one that I brought because it's kind of the more extreme side of it. That is something that was questioned. This is the border policeman giving a presentation in an elementary school in Tel Aviv around crowd dispersal equipment, and literally letting 8-year-old kids playing around with tear gas. That is something that made headlines. That is something that parents were like, no, wait, that's kind of too much. But the interesting thing for me is to say, well, that might be too much, but we don't think this is too much. As a society, kind of the level of what we are willing to accept is extremely high. By the time we get to high school, we have teachers coming in and out of classrooms explaining about soldiers coming in and out of classrooms explaining about the different units. You have a day in which different units put up stalls and try to kind of convince you to go to this unit or another. In the 11th grade, there's a week of basic training. So you go out with your classmates to a military camp and play soldier for a week. Wear a uniform, roll, jump, learn how to shoot, and that's all part of school activity. So really, by the time that you are 18 and supposed to join the military, everything around you has prepared you for that. Just to clarify how official the relationship between the Ministry of Education and the military is, beyond the fact that there's a joint unit of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Defence that build curricula together. There's also today a program, there's a reform in the secondary education, and there's a program that gives financial incentives to teachers to increase the excellence of their students, which is measured in 2 ways. Academic, meaning if your students get better grades, you get paid for it as a teacher. And then the other way is called social responsibility, which includes enlistment rates. So literally, as a teacher, you'll get paid more if more of your students go to the military. So this is something that's kind of very clearly part of the goals of the Ministry of Education. What you see here is a very nice farewell party between a general who is the head of the South District of the military, and the lady from the Ministry of Education is the head of the South District of the Ministry of Education. They're thanking each other here for years of cooperation because the general is retiring. But the really interesting thing for me in this picture is the farewell gift that this general is giving the lady from the Ministry of Education. And you probably can't see it very well, so I'll have to walk you through it. On the far left, the picture that you see is it's a sculpture that's in the old city of Jerusalem today. It shows Jews taking relics out of the Second Temple when it was destroyed by the Romans. The second picture you might recognize. So you have the child from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in the Second World War surrendering at the end of that. And then the third picture is Israeli paratroopers at the Wailing Wall when they occupied it in 1967. And for Israelis, those pictures are all things that we know what they are, like they're very iconic pictures. But putting the three of them together also tells a story. It gives you the answer to the problem, right? We have the problem, historical persecution of Jews going 2,000-3,000 years back. You have the Holocaust, obviously the worst example of what that can look like. And then you have an answer. And the answer is the Israeli paratroopers liberating the Wailing Wall in 1967. Another example of that narrative that is probably even stronger for most Israelis is in the Hebrew calendar, the month between April and May. It starts with Passover. Does anyone kind of know the story of Passover? More or less. Exodus from Egypt. It's a story of liberation from persecution, right? And the main commandment of the holiday, does anyone know what it is? Remember. Right, the main commandment is remembering. And you have a lot of different takes about what is it that you're going to remember out of that. I can tell you what I was taught and what kind of the dominant Israeli narrative is. Probably the best way to show it, one of the songs that we sing in the Passover dinner, and this is like the most important dinner of the year. You can't miss it. This is like Christmas. You have to be there. And one of the songs that we sing translates into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us, and then God saves us from them. Right, and this is kind of the main thing that we're taught to remember. You're supposed to tell the story of this persecution from generation to generation. Exactly a week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. Exactly a week after that is the Soldiers' Memorial Day. And the following morning is Independence Day. And in many ways, that's the same story, you know? Thousands of years of persecution, Holocaust, and the answer to it. Soldiers, including soldiers dying now, like it's an ongoing process, but the state being an answer to that. And I think that having that narrative is a huge part of why Israelis joined the military. Because one of the things that this narrative means is that it makes the whole idea of persecution of Jews, or specifically of you as an Israeli, something existential. It's not a question of why, it's not a question of anything, it's just something that happens for the last 3,000 years. So like, I grew up in Jerusalem, Second Intifada, buses blowing up in the streets. And one of the amazing things to see about that is how much people didn't ask why. And the reason is that if you have this picture in your head, that this has been going on for 3,000 years, then you don't have to ask why, right? Because that's just what happens. And I think that for us as a society, that's one of probably the saddest thing. I mean, now in the last few months, when we've had more and more cases of Palestinians coming out and stabbing people, you have 14-year-old girl from Hebron coming into Jerusalem and trying to stab people with scissors and getting shot for that. And I would like to think that as a society, the first thing that we do is say, why? Why would a 13-year-old do that? And try to address those issues. But instead, we already know the answer. The answer is everybody hates Jews, that's just the way it is, that's the way it's going to be. And then the only solution that you have for that is kind of living on your sword, is doing the last picture of that. And I think that's a really strong narrative within Israeli society that we kind of have to understand how we break down. That's kind of the more visible things, and the things that most Israelis really are exposed to and see quite a lot. The other part of what I want to talk about, again, is kind of some of the other social effects, because conscription and militarism affect us in a lot of different ways. It affects the gender dynamics within a society. Military service is obviously a very masculine thing, even if women serve, and women do serve in the Israeli military, but it's a very masculine environment. And so that translates into civil society. Militarism affects politics. So today we have now the second in the history of the state of Israel since 1967, since the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, there have been 2 ministers of defense who weren't high-ranking generals before becoming Minister of Defense. Now is the second one that we have. So it means that the political system itself is militarized. And just kind of to think about what does it mean to have a high-ranking general be the Minister of Defense, it means that we take someone who from the age of 18 until he retired somewhere in his 60s has done nothing else in his life but to be a soldier. And then he goes into the political system and becomes Minister of Defense. Now you give someone like that problem, I don't know, any problem, rockets coming in from Gaza, what are they going to do? Like, they've literally not done anything else in their lives but military solutions. Yes, you're going to find a lot of military solutions. And the whole political system is geared around that. And another thing that kind of high-ranking generals do after retiring is go into the military industry. And this is another thing that I think is really important to talk about, because when we talk about militarism, it also means that the economy itself is militarized. And that's something that usually we don't kind of talk about because we don't see it. But it's a huge part of the system that we live in at the moment. And if we look, this is just talking about Israeli spending on arms. So Israel today is one of the 4th biggest weapons exporters in the world. Sorry, not exporters, spenders in the world, in percentage of GDP. So in absolute numbers, no one can compete with the US, and I hope no one tries. But in percentage of the size of the economy of GDP, Israel is the 4th biggest spender on arms. It means that that's the biggest budget within our budget. But I think that the more interesting thing is not just the spending, but the profit that comes out of it. Because Israel today is also one of the 10 biggest weapons exporters in the world in absolute numbers. If you try to calculate that per capita or per size of GDP, it is the #1 weapons exporter in the world. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is Israel so successful in exporting arms? Yeah, you keep using weapons, you both become better at producing them and become much better at selling them. So you have a quote here from a marketer in one of the big weapons companies saying, "A scenario in which there won't be a big military operation for 20 years will severely harm the arms industries." We'll all be very sad if that happens, don't we? But the thing is that they say it, they know it. They know that their sales are dependent on not only developing weapons on civilian population, because that's what happens today. You go to a protest in a Palestinian village and you'll have this big strange machine coming and doing something and you're not quite sure what it actually does, and then it drives away and you never see it again. And you can kind of say, oh, that's what a failed experiment looks like. Or you go to a different village and they start shooting you with this kind of water cannon with really stinky water. It's called skunk water. And that works. And like the whole protest runs away from skunk water faster than they run away from live ammunition. And then you see that sold to the Baltimore Police Department after the protests in Baltimore. So you can really see in the protests how these things are developed, they're tested, some things fail, some things succeed, you kind of develop them. But the other part of it is really marketing. And the marketing of arms, I don't know how many of you have ever been to an arms exhibit. Anyone? Nobody? Yes, thank you. I really encourage you to go. Like, I really actually think it's important for us to understand a little bit about how these mechanisms work. But in general terms, arms exhibits look a lot like, I don't know exactly what the comparison is, but you'd have different companies with different stalls trying to like convince you to buy this thing or the other, and they have these really nice 3D high-tech animated videos of whatever their weapon is doing. And most countries would have animated videos. Israel can have non-animated ones. They can actually show you the footage of the drone attack from the last attack on Gaza in 2014 and show you what it does. And as far as militaries are concerned, there's no better way of knowing your weapon is going to work than actually seeing it work, right? So that's a sale point. If you look at here to the right, that poster, it's a poster for the Hermes 450 drone of Elbit Systems, and you can't really read it up there, but there's a stamp over there that says battle proven, right? That's what you want from your weapons. You want them to be battle proven. And Israel can do that better than any other country because we have a civilian population to constantly prove it on. On the left here, what you have is a list of military systems that had their first operational debut in 2014 in the attack on Gaza. And less than a month after that, there was already a drone exhibit selling a lot of the same arms. What that means is also that anywhere you'll go in the world, really anywhere you go, you'll find these weapons. And you'll find this technology. So here to the left is the wall being built between the US and Mexico and Arizona. It's an Israeli company doing the technology around it, same one that did the technology back home on the wall in Palestine. On the right, you can see IDF vehicles patrolling the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It's not only weapons. Usually we kind of talk about arms industries as, you know, tanks and airplanes. It's also a lot of technology. So Israeli surveillance companies working in South Sudan. This is part of a UN report talking about South Sudanese government using the service's ability to identify and illegally apprehend individuals. This has been significantly enhanced since the beginning of the conflict because it has required additional communication interception equipment from Israel. So selling, I mean, really any human right violating country you can think about, selling them the technology to allow them to do that. And it's not just South Sudan, it's Saudi Arabia, it's, Mexico, literally any country, the US, the UK, any country you can possibly think about, that technology is sold there as well. And I think for me, one of the kind of interesting entry point that allows is that in many ways, it allows to build forms of solidarity that aren't necessarily obvious otherwise. Because in the end of the line, we all suffer from a lot of these same policies. And it's not just the Israeli military industry. Israel has an advantage in the military industry, but obviously this is a global phenomena. And it's also an opportunity to look at how these mechanisms are used against different communities and build solidarity ties between them. Just as an example, it's a really small example, but it was really nice to see back in 2014, during the attack on Gaza, just a few months before that, the protests in Ferguson were happening in the US. And so you had Palestinian activists tweeting their counterparts in Ferguson what to do with tear gas, because it's the same kind of tear gas, it's an American-made tear gas, so they had a lot of practice with it, and kind of tweeting them, how do you deal with this? And starting to build ties between those communities, and ties that later on can also be turned into mobilization. For instance, looking at the tear gas manufacturing company out of Pennsylvania and saying, well, we can actually campaign against them for what they're doing in Ferguson and for what they're doing in Palestine at the same time. So for me, a lot of kind of what we can do is really see some of those connections. I want to end just kind of in a little bit of a more optimistic note, or at least talk a little bit about also what's done to counter a lot of that. And part of it is really just on the basic level of people saying that they're not going to be part of it. And so every year we have young Israelis who refuse military service. Some of them do it more publicly, say to the military, we refuse because of the occupation or whatever other reason, and as a result are imprisoned. Others choose different ways. There's you can get out through mental health rather easily. So there's quite a big part of the population that just find their way out through there. So there's a lot of youth who are resisting in different ways just by refusing to be part of the system itself. And others also really mobilizing around them. The group here on the right is a group of Palestinian Druze who refuse military service. They're the only part of Palestinian society that is drafted under Israeli law. And they're kind of mobilizing around having objection to the draft in their community. On the left is a summer camp talking about militarization and refusal as well for Jewish Israeli youth. So there's constantly both discussion with youth and youth who are making that decision, with all the consequences that means, sometimes prison, always some kind of social price to pay for that act. So I think it's important to kind of look at that. And then the other side of that is many times asking other people around the world also to refuse to be part of things that they're against, and kind of taking responsibility about it. And many times in other places in the world, that responsibility means looking at where your money goes. Because a lot of the involvement of other countries in the world in what's going on in Israel-Palestine is economic. So you can see here protests against Hewlett-Packard, the computer company that's involved in Israeli checkpoints. And the idea is to really have people around the world who are against those checkpoints and say that they are, actually do something about it. Then don't buy HP products, then call your pension fund to divest from them, then try to be active and say, we're not going to be part of something that we disagree with, kind of in the same line of what refusers do, refusing military service. We'll just say that this is also not, as I said before, it's not just about Israel-Palestine. Like, we shouldn't do this only for the sake of Israel-Palestine. And for us, as Israeli activists, also part of what we do is try to prevent sales of arms to South Sudan for the sake of South Sudan. I mean, it's important to kind of look at it as a global issue.